Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming here in person, and those of you who have joined us online. Thank you also very much to Kina, who's doing a fabulous job, to Lauren, who has got us all here and got us prepped, and really to the foundation, and the Nimitz Foundation and the museum, for making storytelling a priority. For sharing these stories, especially some of the lesser known ones, and something to be viewed as important, because I truly, as was said at the beginning of this symposium, I believe in the relevance of everything I and the rest of the speakers are going to be talking about today. And there are lessons in this we can all take with us into the future. So thank you all here for making that a priority. So I'm an author and a journalist. I wrote The Girls of Atomic City, and I often get asked when I'm giving talks what made me want to do this story, or how did I come across this story? And this is how I came across this story. So as an author, all I do is write stories for a living. Narrative, nonfiction, true stories. Everything in here is absolutely true. I constantly keep lists of ideas. I keep them on paper primarily. I occasionally keep them on my phone or on the computer. And then every once in a while, when it's time to take up a new project, I go back and look at them. And sometimes I pick up a story and I go, wow, that's the worst idea I have ever heard in my life. And other times there are just things that will not let me go. And this was one of those things that just tickled my brain for too long, and I had to dive into it. This photo is the reason I ended up doing the book. I was actually working on a completely different project for the Smithsonian Museums, actually. And in the process of that, I was writing a bit about nuclear energy, nuclear medicine, that sort of thing. And I came across this. I went down a rabbit hole on the internet. I was distracted and ended up, browsing the DOE website, as one does. I'm sure you guys all always end up on the DOE site when you're browsing the internet. And there was a little history corner, and this photo was in it. And I just thought it was a beautiful photo. I love the perspective, the fashion, all of it. And it was just a caption. There wasn't an article. And it said, "These young women, many of them teenagers from rural areas in Tennessee, are enriching uranium for the first atomic bomb. None of them will know that until the end of the war." And I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. And this was not the first history book I had written. I have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in the sciences. I knew a lot, I thought, about the Manhattan Project. So I thought maybe this is just one of those knowledge gaps. We all have them. Maybe I was asleep in history class that day. And so I called some friends, professor of history at a very reputable university, and another professor of English, and just a voracious nonfiction reader. And I mentioned this to them, and I said, "Do you know anything about a bunch of teenage girls enriching uranium in Tennessee?" And they said, "No." And that's when I realized there was an aspect of this that was missing, because my perspective, and everyone I talked to, their perspective on the Manhattan Project was this perspective. Now, this is a fascinating perspective. I've read books by all these people. I love this history. This is a very top-down look at history, from the point of view of the people who held all the cards, from the people making all the decisions, from the people who knew everything. But the fact of the matter is, there were tens of thousands of people all over, people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, people of color, women, people with very little education, who were doing crucial jobs that enabled this project to take place. So I'm going to go out on a limb and assume a lot of people in here saw Oppenheimer. Yeah, a lot of nods. Okay. Does everyone remember the marbles in the jar? Okay. The marbles in that jar were these women. And the project doesn't take place unless they fill the jar with the marbles. So I became obsessed with trying to tell the story of the Manhattan Project through the experiences of the women sitting on these stools. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, luckily, because Oak Ridge was only about 2 hours away, so I drove over and just started looking around. I eventually contacted a man who wrote for the local newspaper, wrote a little history column, And I said, is there anybody here who was around during World War II? And he said, yeah, I'll take you to meet some folks. So he takes me to the local assisted living center, and the first person I interviewed ended up being the man in the back of this picture, and that is Connie Bowling. And so the first person interviewed for the Girls of Atomic City was a man, and Connie was amazing. He was 101 years old when I talked to him. It is a very special thing to talk to anyone who has been on the planet that long, I'll tell you that. Sharp as a tack, and had such incredible stories. And I'm leaving, and I'm in the lobby of the assisted living facility, and I start talking to people to find out if they were here, and I see this amazing vision of a woman in this like leopard hat, and it was like 2 months before Christmas, and she had the twinkly blinking lights on, and I thought, oh my God, I really hope you were here during the Manhattan Project. And she was, and for those of you who read the book, I talked to a couple of you who've already had, that was Colleen, and she ended up being a key person in the book. So I said, do you mind if I interview you? I'm thinking about writing about all of your experiences. And she said something that every single person I met and approached about being interviewed, men and women alike, kept coming up. She said, why do you want to talk to me? I didn't know anything. And this was fascinating to me. You had decades of people who had just sort of, because of the way everything had been shared, really devalued their contribution. Didn't see how significant they were because everybody was so focused on everybody else. So at first they thought they didn't have anything to say. Well, I go up to her room. She invites over Dot and Celia and to come in. She gets out the wine. They had plenty to say. Photographs, notebooks. And so when it came time, I talked to everybody. I basically stalked people in the lobby of the assisted living center. And, you know, occasionally I would ask someone if they had been there during World War II, and it would turn out they were like 68 years old. And I blame bad industrial lighting, but there was no shortage of people to talk to. I had to decide basically who was going to end up on the cutting room floor. So I tried to choose women who had specific views about what was going on in the war and in Oak Ridge specifically. And so here are some of those folks. So this is Celia. Celia was the child of Polish immigrants, grew up not speaking English, ended up getting a job in New York City. She was a secretary in an office. She had a war job, she thought. Well, she was working for the Manhattan Project. She just didn't know that. And one day her boss calls her into the office and says, we are moving offices. I would love for you to come with us. You're doing a great job. She goes, oh, great, thank you. Where are we going? The South. Okay. How long am I going to be there? 6 months, maybe 9. It really depends. Okay. And what am I going to be doing? Pretty much the same thing you're doing here, but that could change. She said, okay, if you're not going to tell me where I'm going, how am I going to get there? He said, well, a car's going to come pick you up at your sister's apartment where she lived, and that car's going to take you to the train station. There will be a ticket waiting for you. Someone on the train will tell you when to get off, and then a car will come pick you up and take you where you're going. And she goes, okay. Now, to me, I have friends sending their kids to college with cell phones, and they can be contacted at any minute. These women were incredibly adventurous and brave in my book. And I said to her, what on earth made you, do that? I'm so in awe. And she said, well, I had a brother in Italy, and I had another brother who was going to end up in the Pacific. And she said, I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew it was going to help the war, and that was enough for me. And that came up constantly. It's very, very hard, unless you lived through it, to understand the impact that World War II had here at home on everyone's lives. It was everywhere. Songs on the radio were about the war. Superman comic strips were about the war. There were, USO dances, and there were, drives, and there were rations. It infiltrated every aspect of their lives. So pretty much everybody said, I was supposed to do my part. I knew this was doing my part, even though I didn't know what I was doing. So Celia leaves New York City and ends up here. And this is Oak Ridge, one of the 7 gates to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And everything was inspected going in and out, a high security, and we'll get into even more of that as I go on. She was issued 2 different badges. You had a badge for where you lived in Oak Ridge, and you also had a separate badge for where you worked. Now, if you notice at the top here, it says Clinton Engineer Works, which was the name for what would eventually be called Oak Ridge or Site X in other aspects of the Manhattan Project documentation. And that was because this was under the purview from an engineering standpoint of the Army Corps of Engineers. And so they named it by the nearest town, and one of the nearest towns in Oak Ridge was Clinton. So this is a residence pass. The pass that you had to work was very specific, not just the building you were in, but color-coded, things that would dictate where you could go to the bathroom, which cafeterias you could eat in. If you worked at the K-25 facility, for example, you couldn't even get on a bus going to the Y-12 facility. They kept everybody very channeled. This is also what she found coming out of New York City. A lot of mud. So it's important to understand that Oak Ridge was a purpose-built town. Oak Ridge did not exist before the war. With a lot of things in World War II, there was a factory that was maybe making pots and pans, and it was, shifted goals during the war to make ammunition or plane parts or whatever. Oak Ridge was a town of between 56 and 58,000 acres, taken by eminent domain by the government. A lot of people had as little as 2 weeks to vacate their premises. They would find notices tacked up to their trees saying, you have to get out, the government is coming in. It was very traumatic. I talked to people 5 years ago when I was there who have families who were still very upset about that. And a lot of the people kicked off their land actually ended up working in Oak Ridge. That was always a very difficult thing for them to do. But it was a huge facility, and between end of 1942 and the end of the war, Oak Ridge went from not existing to having close to 80,000 residents using more electricity than New York City and the 6th largest bus system in the country, and it wasn't on a map. So when you work that quickly and you dig up those trees so quickly and the Tennessee rains come, this is what happens. Everybody had something to say about mud. I mentioned Clinton a second ago. This is Tony. Tony provided kind of the local perspective on Oak Ridge. So even though Oak Ridge was top secret, it wasn't invisible. It was very clear to people who lived down the road something very big was going on. The construction took place at an unbelievable pace, probably nothing ever seen since. And Tony, who lived in Clinton, they started to know people who were going over there and working and noticing everything that was going on. And what people would say is, because trains and trucks and would pull up to the edge of the reservation, as they called it, and they would go in full of all sorts of stuff, and they would come out with nothing. So everybody in Tony's town, she said, kept saying, everything's going in and nothing's coming out. What are they? Everything's going in, nothing's coming out. Well, what was coming out was about a coffee cup-sized container that was in a briefcase, that was handcuffed to a guy's wrist who got on a train in Tennessee and went all the way to New Mexico. So this entire 58,000 acres and all this machinery for the marble, for the little marble. So she was excited. She graduated high school in 43, was hoping to get a job. The Depression was not a distant memory for these folks. And she said, I can't wait to get over there and, find out what's going on. Well, spoiler alert, she didn't find out what was going on until the very end. This is a wonderful September 1943 Norman Rockwell image. I love this because it really captures the multiplicity of roles that women took on during the war. It was a transformative moment in the world of women's work. So if you see here, I mean, she's got a compass, she's got a nurse's cap, she's got a bus driver's cap, she's got a wrench. but she also has her watering can and her hoe for her victory garden, which was encouraged for everyone to take place, have their own garden. And she also has milk on her hip because in addition to all of these new responsibilities, she was still responsible for maintaining her home and raising her children. And then after the war, there's a whole separate talk. A lot of those roles were, taken away from them, and it was another big transformative moment in the world of women's work. And because Oak Ridge was an actual city, there were all sorts of jobs. There were women who had administrative roles. These are some bus drivers. This is my favorite. Maybe not for our crowd, but when I give this talk to schools, they just look at this photo. I'm like, yes, phones used to be attached to the wall by a wire. And, they never wanted any calls to drop. So these are women just waiting for the shift change to jump on in. And, of course, there were WACs in Oak Ridge as well. This is an Oak Ridge Rosie riveter of sorts. And because it was Oak Ridge, there were also more interesting jobs, such as this woman wielding an early version of a Geiger counter. And this is a close-up of one of the electromagnetic separation units in the Y-12 facility. And this is a young woman monitoring those needles and dials. And there was also a recreation arm as well that I'll get more into. This is Elizabeth Edwards. She started the public library in Oak Ridge. They brought her down from the main branch of the public library in New York City. And she, in addition to having a library, created like one of the first mobile libraries in the country where they would take books out to folks who couldn't get access to the library. And the town grew initially. When they started planning this, they thought 13,000 people would live here. Well, 80,000, as I said. So there were lines everywhere, and housing became quite challenging. This is Helen. I'm going to show you some of my ladies as they were when I interviewed them. Helen was a young basketball player from Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and she was recruited out of a diner. There was a guy who kept coming into the diner and pharmacy where she worked. And one day she's leaving work and she's walking down the street and he comes up to her and he said, you're very efficient. You do a really, really good job. She was like, oh, thank you. And he said, how would you like a job working for the war effort? He said, can we talk, and she said, and so he wanted to go talk down this alley. I'm like, what are you thinking? This sounds like the beginning of a Criminal Minds episode. And so she goes, and he says, would you like to come work for the war effort in East Tennessee? And she was like, well, I don't know. And he said, it's 78 cents an hour. She said, okay. And she got on a bus the next day, and off she went to do she knew not what. So this is Celia after 6 to 9 months in Oak Ridge, as she was told. She actually never, ever left and stayed there for quite some time. This is Jane. She was a statistician from Paris, Tennessee. And she has a great, great story as well that I'll get into. This is Rosemary. She was a nurse recruited from Chicago and worked in the hospital, which was a whole other perspective because, again, there were families there. So they were treating everything from conditions they didn't quite understand yet because it was so early in the development of these technologies and the side effects that could result to the flu. Somebody had the sniffles, a kid had to go to school. And this is wonderful Colleen, who I met. She's not wearing her leopard in this. Colleen was a wonderful way to look at families coming to Oak Ridge because it was not unusual for an entire family to move there to do work. And that's what Colleen's family did. This was her actual, her work badge. So Colleen and 8 of her relatives came to work in Oak Ridge. This is where they lived. I said housing got tight. So eventually, when they were at the height of building the actual houses where some of the upper-level scientists would live, people would talk about going to work in the morning and coming back, and there 5 new houses would be on the street. They had just crews going around. One crew would lay the foundation. The next crew would put up, struts. The next crew would come in and put in the chimney. And it went very, very quickly, but just not enough. So they ended up just raising entire swaths of land and bringing in trailers on the train. And this is Happy Valley. I know this screams Happy Valley. No joke, that's what it's called. And this is where, in a double trailer, is where Colleen and 8 of her family members lived. There was no indoor plumbing. They slept. Oak Ridge ran 24 hours a day, so they slept in shifts. They ate in shifts. They watched the younger children in shifts, and because they were all working. In fact, Colleen's youngest sister, the first time she saw her mother in pants and bobby socks, started crying. She could not believe her mother was dressed like that. And when I talked to Colleen about, what brought her entire family there, and she also had cousins and aunts there too, she too said her brother Jimmy was over fighting in Europe. So one of the first things they did when they got in their trailer, like many other family, was hang their Blue Star flag. And this is some of whoever's interested, you can go to the National Archives website and find a lot of the interesting posters and propaganda that were popular during World War II. So this one, I'm sure this crowd is probably familiar with Blue Star families and Gold Star families. Blue Star, you had someone away fighting. Gold Star, you had actually lost someone. So in this one, there is a Gold Star because somebody talked. So it's not a Blue Star anymore. This is where Colleen worked. This is the K-25 facility. This was, during the war and for quite some time, the largest building on the planet. People who worked there were bicycles that would go from one part of the plant to another. I always thought it was kind of funny that a project trying to keep its aim completely secret basically builds a building that can be seen from space shaped like a U when they're enriching uranium. This is where Colleen worked. She worked as a leak tester with pipes. She worked with pipes. Up there at the top, you can see a little millwright, and they are ferrying a pipe over. And so Colleen's job was to take a probe and run it over various seals. And if the machine beeped, that meant there was a leak. She sent it through that door. If the machine didn't beep, that meant the seal was fine, and it went through another door. She didn't know the machine was a mass spectrometer. She would find that out many years later. But to her, the project had something to do with pipes. And this is the thing, because everybody was so funneled, their idea of what could possibly be going on was based on what they experienced. So there was a woman who actually worked with processing people when they came in. Everybody had to give urine samples. She was convinced they'd figured out a way to weaponize urine, and that's what the Manhattan Project was doing. This is Katie. Those are Katie's biscuit pans. Katie was a way to examine segregation in Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was completely segregated. There were only, black workers could only work in construction, in domestic services, or as a janitor. Katie was a janitor. I would like to mention now Ed Westcott, who took all of these photos. He was the official photographer for the War Department, as it was called, and he went out of his way to make sure he captured everything in Oak Ridge, and we are grateful for that. This is where Katie lived. It was called the Hutments. It was a 16 by 16 square foot space she shared with 4 to 5 other people. No locking doors, no real windows. She was not allowed, she and her husband, to bring their children with them. They stayed back home in Auburn, Alabama with her mother. I asked her why she did that and how she managed to do that. And she said they were offering more than twice the highest rate she could get in Auburn. And she sent money home every week. Huge part of the Manhattan Project, the black community, and one that didn't get a lot of attention at the time. In addition to the Atomic Energy Commission filings, I did research in the Fair Employment Practice Commission filings. This is a letter of complaint written to the president by a black man working in Oak Ridge, complaining about the fact that there were curfews and guards were walking into his wife's hutment without knocking on the door. It was very rough. Katie tried to make the best of it. She asked a guy in K-25, a welder, to make her a biscuit pan. He made her 3. They're almost rectangular. And she made really great biscuits. And she started bribing the guards with biscuits to let her visit her husband whenever she wanted. This is Jane. She wanted to be an engineer. She went to the University of Tennessee registration, was yanked out of line, and said, "I'm sorry, girls don't get to study engineering." She said, "But look at all my, brilliant woman." He said, "That's really nice. You're very smart. You can go be a statistician." She was furious, but she went to go be a statistician and ended up running a room of computers in Oak Ridge. And in Oak Ridge, a room of computers was a group of people doing a lot of very high-level math, and then Jane would review their results, take that information, and it went in a sealed envelope, and a guy on a bicycle came and took it, and off it went. She did not know where. But she did get a visit one day at work from a very tall, thin man in an interesting hat, and that man was Oppenheimer. When I interviewed Jane, I went to her house a couple times, and this was one of a million pieces. Her family hated that she was a pack rat. For me, when you are doing research, I think we were talking about this last night at dinner, boxes and boxes of paper she refused to throw away. I was like, this is fantastic. There were also a few things that had high-level calculus about, she was computing the percentages of enriched uranium. That was their job, very, very important. Stamped top secret that had never been redacted. I was like, Jane, you probably shouldn't have taken these. She goes, I know. Should I give them back now? I was like, no, let me see it. Give me. This one caught my eye. She was a great way to look at like treatment in the workforce at Oak Ridge. I looked at those Post-its. The minute she saw those Post-its, she was about 88 when I interviewed her. She got irate. So that says, she said, I put that Post-it on there when I was in my 70s. I didn't want to forget. Had men under me making more than me. She wanted to stay angry. She said, I put that on years ago, and I always go back and look at it. So how do you keep a project this big secret? Well, you had lots of reminders everywhere. There were also official spies, government spies, who were just watching everyone, asking you for your badge, shining flashlights in the movie theater. And then there were people who were actually recruited to be spies, like Helen. She was 18, taken out of her dorm one night by, sounds cliche, but it's true, guys in dark suits, and said, would you mind listening carefully to the conversations in the dorm and at work and cafeteria? If you hear people being too chatty or asking too many questions, here's a form, just write their names down, and here's an envelope, and there's an anonymous drop box, and no one will ever know it's you. And it was addressed to the Acme Insurance Agency, which sounds like it's like Wile E. Coyote or something, you know. But everybody I talked, you always knew, you lived there knowing the person next to you might be reporting what you were saying, and if you got busted, you lost your job, you lost a place to live, and you were disappeared, essentially. So people grew up with a tremendous amount of security, including the Girl Scouts. And they also grew up with a lot of stress. They were there with a lot of stress. It was very crowded. There were a lot of lines. Colleen liked to say, if I saw a line, I got on it. It must have been something good. It was hard to work 24 hours a day on something you didn't know what it was, but you knew you had to hurry up, but you didn't know what the deadline was. So in order to make people feel a little better, they did a couple things. One, they brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Eric Clark, fascinating. He was not called a psychiatrist. He was the doctor you went to see if you were too tired. And they also created a massive recreation program. There were dances every night of the week. There was an orchestra. There was an acting club. There was a rabbit breeding club, like they need help. There were people, they were always raising money. There was a football team for the kids. They were not allowed to give a roster of players' names to the opposing team because somebody might be able to figure out who their father was, and they would know those people were stationed at Oak Ridge. And, of course, bowling, because everybody loves bowling. I love bowling. So people are working, and then in August of 1945, the war begins to come to an end. Didn't end in August, obviously, but they find out that the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare, the test, of course, had been about a month earlier, ever used in warfare had detonated over Hiroshima, Japan. Now, people found out in various ways. There wasn't, Twitter, and they didn't have phones, most of them. most of them listened to the Truman radio address. First, it's just a bunch of information about a new kind of weapon, and then at the very end, they mention Oak Ridge, and they were like, I'm sorry, excuse me? And that's how the vast majority of them found out what they had been working on. And the question then became, what's going to happen? Because is this place going to stay? Are we going to get to keep staying here? Some people were ready to go. But a lot of people, they'd really grown quite attached to Oak Ridge. And one of the things that the military didn't project when they were creating this was community. These people became very attached to each other. They met. They socialized. They shared sadness about losing people in war. And they really found it's very interesting to be the first residents ever of a city. I mean, I certainly don't know what that's like. And there were a lot of them who actually wanted to stay. And there were also a lot of, marriages and babies. The average age was between 26 and 28. You take a bunch of 26 and 28-year-olds, put them behind a fence, and take them to dances every night of the week. There was a lot of hooking up going on. They had one of the highest birth rates in the country. And they really, really kind of dug in, dressed up their shabby little places where they lived, and it became home to a lot of folks. And I know, I love this. Little pugilist kids. So, these are some women on VJ Day outside with their washboards outside of their dorm. These are my ladies later in life. This was a big talk. You can see Dot there in front has a copy of my book. I only mention that because what I loved is that after the book came out, people started showing up. They used to go for coffee at the Panera Bread after Mass in the morning. And it got around town in Oak Ridge that you could go get your book signed by the girls. So they would have these informal little book signings in the Panera Bread in Oak Ridge. And I really loved that. Here's one of my favorite Ed Westcott pictures. If you ever want to see pictures of what went on in the Manhattan Project, not just at Oak Ridge, but also at the other, Hanford and Los Alamos, you can go to the DOE website. I have some on my website, and I really, really highly recommend it. It's a wonderful thing. Anybody who's a teacher, it's a wonderful resource. And I always like to end my talk by saying, again, these folks thought they didn't have anything to say because they didn't know anything. I encourage everybody in here, get into oral histories. If you don't think you have anything to say about your experience, I promise you do. People like me and my wonderful fellow speakers live for that kind of information. If you don't know where to start, go to I'm sure TCU has an oral history program. Go to the Library of Congress has information about how to do your own. Give it to your local library. Give it to a local college or school. You're doing everyone a favor. Not everything is on the internet. So that's where I will end it. Thank you. I listened to them. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. So we have time for some questions. I'm going to remind you every time. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our mic runners in the red are going to come to you, and they're going to hold the mic for you just so we can make sure that our virtual audience can hear you and that we don't get feedback. All right, so we have questions. Don't be shy. All right, we have one in the back here.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Going back to the end of the war and the fact that their job was done and many of them wanted to stay around, were many able to stay around, or did they start dispersing to where they had been?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for example, the Y-12 facility, which had been doing that first image I showed you, the electromagnetic separation process, was very key during the war, but they were really trying to shift to, they were trying to figure out what was the best way to enrich uranium. It's not like they came into this knowing exactly how to do it. The gaseous diffusion process, which took place in K25, which was that big U-shaped building where Colleen worked, that began to take precedence in the actual, how they were going to focus their money and their workforce enriching uranium. So, so someone like Helen, the basketball player, she worked in Y12, sitting on the stool doing the dials. She actually ended up working in the library at Y12. So if people wanted to stay, they did their best to find a place for them to go. And the thing is, I mean, not only did Oak Ridge not shut down, now we were moving into the Cold War. And now we were finding out about what we were going to be able to do with, nuclear energy. And then we get into like, oh my God, atomic toasters. I mean, there was such a craze after the end of the war. So a lot of people were actually able to stay there. Some folks who had been recruited from some of the larger corporations. I mean, the Manhattan Project is really the military-industrial complex. I mean, this really kind of kick-started it. Some of them had to go back to, DuPont or wherever it was they were working. But yeah, a lot of people were able to stay. And if you go to Oak Ridge today, I mean, you can see the original housing, but, they've put like brick siding on it or a cute little porch or whatever. But going to Oak Ridge is amazing because you actually can see what it was like, the layout and everything. Thank you.
All right, we have a question in the middle. And for our virtual audience, you can ask questions as well. Just put it in the chat box for Stephanie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great story of some very inspiring women. Talking to them all these years later, were they universally happy about their contribution, or was there some concern, as you hear about some of the scientists, about the destruction associated with the dropping of the atomic bombs?
Great question. It's as varied as individuals are, is as varied as their responses to the situation was. Now, they were in an interesting situation because they weren't making a choice about it, but they were choosing to do what they needed to for the war in order to, in most of their cases, bring their brothers home, their boyfriends home, other family members. So what I find interesting about the community I talk to is they lived in two completely different worlds. I don't know what it's like to live in a world without nuclear weapons. When I was 8 years old, if they said, the bomb, it's like, oh, mushroom clouds and nuclear winter and fallout. The day they heard Truman's thing, people were talking about the automatic bomb because you didn't even have language for it then. And of course, the first images that came back from Japan had been highly censored. So it showed a lot of building destruction. If you look at the early photos and look at like the firebombing of Tokyo, they look very similar. So it actually, the repercussions and the special cancers and all of those things, that sort of stuff came later. And these people, because of their unique perspective, really could hold on to lots of different feelings. Some of them were, it was war. That's what happens. Other people went on to become anti-nuclear activists. And a lot of people were kind of in the middle. Like Marty, this woman I interviewed, her brother was away fighting. Her parents weren't really in her life, so he was everything to her. And she said, I was so happy because I knew he was coming home and we were going to get to stop doing all this. She said, when I found out, she said, I was so sad that I had something to do with all that, and I just cried. And there was another man I interviewed who had actually seen he wasn't supposed to, he had seen the Trinity test. He had hidden in the bushes. He was in Los Alamos. And then he later in life was a docent at the museum in Oak Ridge. And he said, it was a time of horrors. And this was one horror that ended the other horrors. So it was a hugely varied, from not phased at all to it changing their lives. Yeah.
All right, we have a question back here, and then we'll get you next, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I take it from something you said there were cases of radiation sickness at Oak Ridge?
That's what they probably figured out it was, sure, yeah.
All right, we have a question up here. He's right here in the middle, right there.
No, I'll hold it.
When I went to work at the Atomic Energy Commission in 19 65.
Oh, where were you based? Were
Yeah.
you in Oak Ridge?
My first trip to K-25, if I recall correctly, it was 60 acres under roof.
Yeah. I mean, it was unbelievable, and it wasn't just the largest building during the war. It was the largest building until the 70s. And it came down not long ago, and the footprint of it, now we have the Manhattan Project National Historic Park, which has 3 different sites: Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. And there is a footprint of where K-25 was, and an overview and kind of a discussion of everything that went there. But even just seeing, I saw K-25 when it was still up and it was in the process of being brought down. It took quite some time because of, there were chemical reactions that were still, there's a lot of cleanup that is still going on. But yeah.
It was a noisy place.
I bet. Yes. Yes. The cacophony was like, yeah.
All those gaseous diffusion.
Oh, how exciting.
Yeah. And the second thing we were told was that the guard force was illiterate.
Really?
Yeah.
Never heard that. But, I mean, I don't know. It was, I would find that hard to.
So they didn't know what was going on. They couldn't read, couldn't write.
Oh, during, like, post-war or during the war?
During the war.
I mean, the thing is, secrecy didn't stop just because the war was over. I mean, there is still a bunch of... I did so much research at the National Archives, and there are thousands of boxes of Atomic Energy Commission stuff, the vast majority of which has never been scanned. So who knows what's in there? All you students, get out there. Go start looking at stuff.
All right, we have a question back here in the corner.
Oh, hello.
I just wanted to know if you had gotten any stories from the young children who are now in adulthood, and what those experiences were.
Yes, actually, it was Colleen's youngest sister, Jo. She had, like I said, she had eight brothers and sisters. She was quite young. She's the one who cried when she saw her mom in pants. Jo talked about she was about 4 or 5. She was sent to nursery school. Of course, there were great schools in Oak Ridge because the scientists that they were bringing in from these big cities, they wanted to make sure their kids were going to get a good education. There were incredible schools there. Jo went to nursery school. She said she couldn't pronounce it correctly, so she kept calling it Nazi school. And that was one of her biggest memories. But she also talked about, and this was interesting to get the kid perspective, so where the trailers were was actually quite close to one of the perimeters, and the perimeter, one of the ways that it was monitored was on horseback. And so a lot of the, young people and young adults who'd like to go out, out by the fence and watch the horses go by. But Jo said she never liked to go because she thought the Germans were on the other side of the fence. So that's how tight that was in Oak Ridge and how small her world became. The Germans were on the other side of the fence.
All right, we have a question from our virtual audience right here.
You don't look virtual.
I am virtual. Do you feel that the women have gotten the proper recognition now?
Oh, yeah, well, more than they did. I think, and not just in the Manhattan Project. I think there has been kind of more of a groundswell to tell stories from marginalized voices, not just women, like I said, from, indigenous community, Black community, Latinx community, and that's wonderful. So they have gotten a lot more recognition, and not just, World War II, but other roles. It's one of my favorite ways to look at various points in history. So yeah, I think we're on the right track. Don't give up, is what I would say.
Thank you. We have a question right here.
Of the women that you did interview that were there, how many of them, of course their lives changed, but once Oak Ridge service was finished for them, did they go and work other places, or would they go back to being housewives?
Oh, so this is a very interesting question because whether or not they went back to being housewives, some did. Some had kids to raise, and this, that, and the other thing. But it was a choice of theirs. So throughout the United States of America, women rallied to the cause. Right? People were away fighting, and they showed up, and they started having jobs and financial independence like they had never ever had before. Then at the end of the war, rightly so, jobs were waiting for, the soldiers who were coming back. And that is good and true, and that's the way it should have been. But that meant that a lot of women who were really liking working, they were like, well, thanks. Okay, you can go now. What was interesting about Oak Ridge is that these women were trained to do something nobody else knew how to do. Even if they didn't know the science behind it, they knew how to do their job. And their jobs never existed before the war. So actually, a lot of the women in Oak Ridge, if they wanted to keep working, they got to keep working. So that's a great question. It's a very interesting contrast and different than what went on in the majority of cities in the United States.
All right, I saw this hand go up first, and then we'll take a question from our virtual audience.
What percentage of the workforce at Oak Ridge were female?
It was I can tell you why 12 had, during the course of the war, about 22,000 young women, and that was just one facility. The majority of people working at Oak Ridge were women, a large majority. I can't give you an exact percentage. And actually, it's very difficult to get. I often get people writing through the website, I heard my family worked in Oak Ridge, how do I find them? I'm like, good luck, because of those thousands of boxes I talked about that, still haven't been processed in the National Archives. The other thing was turnover was a huge problem in Oak Ridge. I mean, if you were there and you took your job, you didn't have to stay. If you wanted to leave, you could. And a lot of people did because they didn't like the mud, they didn't like the housing, they didn't like the conditions. It's exhausting working somewhere that was open 24 hours a day and they had 3 shifts. Like sometimes you were working the morning shift, sometimes you were working the graveyard shift. So leaving, that happened. And that's a problem for any project today or then that is on a deadline and needs to be efficient. So one of the reasons they brought in the psychiatrists and they brought in this massive recreation project, and reading those documents about when they were deciding what they were going to do, one of the reasons was because they needed to do something about turnover. They were trying to, if somebody came there and was trained, because again, this was specific training, they didn't want them to leave. So actually, there was so much movement of employment. It's actually very hard to track some of it. There's a Alex. You guys might remember his last name. Yes. Oh, Alex Wellerstein, to me, does some of the best and keeps it as up to date as possible. Has some of the best statistics, I think, on not just Oak Ridge, but the Manhattan Project in general, as we continue to see more documents, because as I said, most documents have not been seen. Fascinating, right? God knows what's in there.
These are great questions. We have one from the virtual audience, and then we'll...
You mentioned radiation sickness. Did these men and women suffer a higher proportion of medical problems like cancer later in life?
That's an excellent question and not as easy to answer as you would think. So there is a program that was instated that is still in place today. They were working not just during the Manhattan Project, but afterwards as well, because, all that, the work didn't stop just because the war stopped. The women I talked to, and I go into this a little bit in the book, some of them were randomly asked to wear film, which was one of the earlier ways to detect radiation. They weren't told why they were wearing it. They just wore it. Katie's husband, who worked in construction, he was told where he worked, where they were digging, They were not allowed to stay in the pit they were digging in more than 10 minutes at a time, and he was told when he went home he had to leave his shoes outside and his clothes. They weren't told why. They were learning about this as this was going on, and continued learning about it afterward. This housing that took place, that they were building constantly and so quickly, used this amazing new material called cemesto, which was a combination of cement and asbestos. It was great. Everybody loved it. So in later years, when people would try to get reparations financially and still do, I had a woman write me through my website about a sickness that her family had, and where she should look for answers. Is that cancer? So what would happen is, well, okay, you worked in Y12. Were you a smoker? So it became like, was it the cemesto? Was it your work? Was it if you worked Y12, they were pretty safe. They were it was actually the women who worked there were probably in one of the safest situations. The people who worked with waste disposal, that was very, very challenging. But there were certain kinds of cancers. The women I interviewed who worked well into their 60s and 70s were constantly getting monitored for beryllium levels and all sorts of things. So how it was treated, how it was identified, of course, changed massively as years went on. But it was a learning curve, and they were at the beginning of that learning curve during the war. But it continued afterward. So it was a long, not so clear answer, but it's a complicated question.
All right, I had a question at the front in the middle, right here in blue.
Okay, so the comment was made that a lot of the women, perhaps other employees, left and went back into society. I mean, the women went to where they were from, Mobile, Alabama.
Sure.
So the question is, I wonder if the government, maybe the FBI, would go interview those women and say, hey, tell us what you did,
to see if they'd chat about it?
Yeah.
Oh, I love this. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's amazing the extent to which the secrecy stayed with this community. It's fascinating, actually. I mean, they were told, not only do you not get to know what you're doing, don't ask questions about what you're doing. Don't ask anybody else about what they're doing. As General Groves liked to say, stick to your knitting. This is what you're doing, and that's all you need to know. You know everything you need to know to serve your purpose within this larger project. So when these people were hired, like Jane, FBI went to Paris, Tennessee, and started talking to her school teachers, her neighbors. Was she a partier? Was she a good kid? This, that, and the other thing. So a lot of these people were checked out before they were hired. But when I was working on the book, and these people are all in their 80s, some of them in their 90s, I was in the museum one day, and this guy came up to me and he said, "Are you that lady working on that book?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you have family who worked here?" He goes, "I keep trying to get my mom to talk to you, but she said, nobody told me I'm allowed to talk about it." So she wouldn't. And I remember at one point I was talking to Dot, who's in the book, and her husband, Paul. And Paul was talking, and Dot all of a sudden said, and Dot was not shy about talking. All of a sudden she said, "Are we supposed to be talking about this?" And this is, 40, 50 years later. It was, so, I mean, I don't know, maybe, possibly. That information might be in one of those boxes that hasn't been gone through yet.
All right, we have time for one more question. All right, here we go, right there.
And some of the other, I guess, in readings of the Manhattan Project, especially Los Alamos, the penetration, the security penetration by, I guess, Soviets at this time. In your research, did you find any penetration of Oak Ridge?
Oh, yes. And actually, I'm not going to, you will hear more about that in the spy talk that's coming later. But David Greenglass, who was one of the better known spies, was in Oak Ridge. The Soviet spy they found in the 21st century, nobody even know what he had done. I'm not sure if he was in Oak Ridge or not, but you're going to hear a very good talk on atomic spies later today. But yeah, David Greenglass came up in my research. He was certainly there. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you all so much for your great questions.
Thank you
so much.